Hello, and welcome to the Dance Physio Podcast, a podcast designed to explore ideas and foster discussion around dancer health and wellness. We're here to challenge the status quo, bridge the gap between dance science and the studio, and help change the landscape of the dance industry for the better. I'm your host, Erika Mayall, a dancer turned physiotherapist who is deeply passionate about leaving the dance world better than I found it. I'm so glad you're here. Let's get started.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Dance Physio Podcast. Before we dive into today's episode, I just want to encourage you to go and sign up for my email newsletter if you have not already. I just finished sending out an email to my email list that is all about postseason and rest in the postseason and what different types of rest look like. So I send these out periodically. I promise you I do not spam you too often with emails because, let's be honest, who has time for that? But I often am sending out little snippets of information and expanding on topics and things like that. So if you want to stay in the loop with things that I have coming up and just in general sort of communication and sending out like dance science tips, dance teaching tips, things like that, I encourage you to sign up for the email newsletter. The link for that is in the show notes, or you can also reach it through my social media platforms. So now that you've done that, we're going to dive into today's podcast episode. And today we're going to talk about accommodating modifications in dance. And this podcast episode came out, the idea sort of resulted from a thread that I put out that I eventually ended up sharing to Instagram a couple of weeks ago. I can't remember exactly when it was, that gained a lot of traction. And I had a lot of sort of comments and interaction and people in my DMs and people feeling strongly one way or another about this thread. So I thought that I would expand on the topic just in a podcast because it's much, much easier for me to express myself this way. So I will read you the thread or the sort of post that got shared to Instagram as well. And then we're going to dive into talking about what exactly I mean by modifications and things like that. So it essentially read, "Dance teachers, can we please stop penalizing dancers for having an injury? The fact that they need to wear a brace or modify a few steps in the dance should not mean that they get pulled from the dance. I promise you your audience or the judges at a competition are not going to care or even notice if a dancer is modifying something. And even if you do lose a mark for it, I guarantee you it's worth it to preserve that dancer's mental health." So that was essentially the sort of, I keep wanting to say tweet, but it was a thread that I put out that, like I said, like really had a lot of interaction and messages and people feeling strongly. And I got so many messages in my DMs of people and comments on the post actually too, but a lot in my DMs of people then sharing stories about times when either they were penalized or their child, like a lot of parents messaging about their dancer being penalized and being pulled from numbers because they were, in the process of recovering from an injury. So before we dive into this a little bit more, I just want to be really clear that I am not necessarily talking about like professional dancers where you are, putting on, say, I don't know, the Nutcracker, let's say, and you have a dancer who's supposed to be dancing a specific role. And if they are not like physically capable of executing that role, like, and we'll just use Sugar Plum Fairy as an example because so many people are familiar with that. If they were in the process of recovering from an injury and maybe couldn't execute a lot of the steps or some of the steps in that role, I don't expect a company to necessarily be able to make those modifications because like with the nature of it being like a professional production where the audience are like paying audiences coming in and expecting a certain product on stage and things like that. Those situations are slightly different though, because those dancers are professionals. They are paid to be doing what they are doing. And they also then, in most cases, and this is a whole nother can of worms we're not going to talk about today, but in most cases, they are then protected by like worker rights laws and things like that. So they although they may not be able to perform roles that they were originally scheduled to perform, they're still getting paid. They're having their like rehab is usually being overseen by the company. And like the situation is just quite different. So I just want to be clear that I'm not necessarily talking about those situations. What I'm talking about more is the dancers that I interact with on a day-to-day basis in the clinic, which tend to be younger dancers, pre-professional dancers, competitive dancers, things like that, where they've maybe had an injury, and then as they're returning to dance, and even when they're cleared to dance with maybe slight modifications here or there, that the studio or teacher or choreographer or whoever it is maybe not accommodating them as best that they could. And so dancers are often feeling like they're being penalized and getting pulled from dances or losing roles and that sort of thing. So that's more the situation that I'm talking about. And it's happened this season. I've seen it happen a lot with competitive dancers specifically, where there has been sort of a hard line of being like, you're either in or you're out. There's no kind of like, oh, we'll make some modifications. And this is definitely not to say that this is like the majority of students or studios that I kind of interact with, because the majority of them are actually fantastic. And the majority of studios are so supportive when dancers are coming back from an injury or have modifications that they need to make. Most studios are really able to accommodate that super well. But in the instances where that is not happening, it has such far-reaching consequences. And one of the biggest things that we see, or one of the things that we have really been trying to change in the dance world kind of collectively over the last 10, 20, 30 years is this idea of like speaking up when you're injured. And like historically, so many dancers have danced through things that they should not, and they've kind of hidden injuries from their teachers or their rehearsal directors or stuff because they're worried about being penalized for it and losing roles and losing casting opportunities and stuff like that. So if we're continuing to take those opportunities away from dancers, we're just perpetuating that. Is a dancer going to come forwards and say, hey, look, I've got this thing going on with my body, like I've been dealing with this injury, if the like kind of repercussion of that is that they're not going to be allowed to dance at all? Whereas like on the other hand, what we want in an ideal dance world is for dancers to feel comfortable to voice what is going on with their body, if they're having pain, if they have an injury, and then having a dance studio environment that can be supportive of that as they're rehabilitating from that injury and being able to accommodate any sort of modifications that need to be made. I will also, just go on and also say that I know that some studios struggle with really knowing like where a dancer's at in terms of like medical clearance, in terms of whether they should or should not be dancing. And so I do know that some studios are sort of saying, no, we don't want you to participate, as a way of like covering their own basis, because they're maybe not 100% sure about where those dancers' restrictions truly lie or truly are. So I know that there's been instances where a dancer will be like, no, I'm 100% fine. My, physio or my doctor, whoever said I can dance. And it turns out that they actually weren't being super truthful about that, and they really weren't supposed to be dancing or weren't supposed to be performing. So I would say for those studios, if that is a concern, if you're a teacher or a studio and you have a concern about, potentially opening yourself up to like liability or risk in terms of allowing a dancer to perform or dance as they're recovering from something, all I would say is really try and communicate directly with the healthcare professionals whenever you can. And so one of the reasons why I feel like we have so many studios in my area who are really willing to make these accommodations is because we have pretty open communication and dialogue between these studios. I have loads of teachers that I communicate with on a regular basis, and we use what's called like a dancer health communication form if we need to, that I can like write out stuff and the dancer can take it to the studio and say, these are the exact restrictions that I have. So there's no like kind of things getting lost in translation, or potentially like worst case scenario, a student or a family being sort of untruthful about maybe where that dancer's limitations are. I will say that that isn't my experience, in that dancers are sort of going against medical advice most of the time, but I do know from speaking with some studio owners and some teachers that that is a concern that they have. And so maybe that's why sometimes they're a little bit more reluctant to make accommodations. So all of those things to just say that there is definitely nuance within this, but overall, I really think that in dance, we have such an ability to make tons of modifications. And it's one of the things that like really makes dance such a great population of athletes to work with, because if you think about other sports and other sort of athletic pursuits, it's often really hard for athletes to modify and still be able to participate as they're recovering from an injury. And so if you think about any sport that is like a timed sport, especially, so you think about like athletics, sprinting, swimming, like anything like that, if you have an athlete who's rehabilitating from an injury or recovering from an injury, you're not going to send them out to a competition if they're like restricted to going at like, 75% speed or like 75% volume of like what they would normally compete at, if that makes sense. So really they have to do so much of that work behind the scenes where they're doing like this really grueling rehab behind the scenes until they're basically 100%, and then they can go back to competition. And in dance, we're so fortunate that like the structure of dance and like just the nature of the activity itself lends itself to rehabilitation so well. And I think I've talked about this before on previous episodes of the podcast, that it is one of the things I love most about the dance is that we can use it as like a gradual way of building up activity and almost using it as rehabilitation if we're doing it smartly and with specific restrictions. And I think the episode that I've talked about this before in quite a lot is the one where I was talking about like why dancers should have access to dance-specific healthcare, because this is where it becomes like so valuable for a dancer to be working with somebody who really understands the nuance of what dance is and different styles of dance and how different styles of dance can be modified for different things. So I will just say that anytime I hear situations where dancers are being penalized for, having to have some modifications applied to their dance really makes me so sad for them, because there's often massive, massive mental health consequences in terms of them feeling, rejected and just like depressed and sad that they can't perform, or that they feel like they've done something wrong. They feel responsible that they've then been like pulled from a dance or pulled from choreography or things like that. So it always makes me so sad, because dance does lend itself so well to these modifications that we can make and still be able to perform or even compete. So that was kind of where I was coming from when I wrote that sort of thread that day. I think I was a bit riled up about something. I can't even remember what at this point, but that was sort of the lens I was coming from, is like, it just makes me so sad when you hear these stories, because oftentimes there's so much a dancer can do, especially at the end stages of rehabilitation. Now, obviously, if a dancer's like acutely sprained their ankle, you're not going to like send them out on stage and be like, they can't do 95% of the stuff. You're not going to say, okay, that dancer should still get to participate. So I'm not talking about injuries like that. I'm talking about dancers who maybe are 80% through their rehabilitation. They can do the vast majority of things, but they need some modifications and need that studio or their teachers to be able to accommodate those mild or slight modifications. So when I'm talking about modifications, there's all sorts of different things that fall into this category. One of the things that we will commonly recommend, or that might be a modification that a dancer might need, is they may need to be still using some sort of like a brace or an external support, or taping is really common. Like even if a dancer's progressed to the point where they don't need a brace anymore, they might still need a little bit of tape as just like extra proprioceptive awareness. Sometimes it's even more psychological than physical support, but it might be something that they need in order to go on stage. And so this is something that like seems so basic and seems like it should be so easy for studios to accommodate. And oftentimes we are hearing stories about dancers not being allowed to use a brace or use tape or anything like that because the teacher, the studio, is worried about like aesthetically, are they going to like lose points at a competition if one dancer, has an ankle support or something like that. And my experience with most competitions, at least locally here, is that dancers are not docked points for things like that at a competition. And like I said in that thread, even if they are, so even if you do lose a mark or half a mark or something because one of your dancers has tape or has a brace or what have you, it is 100% worth it for all the other benefits that that dancer gets from being able to participate. And I think collectively as a group, we need to support that dancer and recognize that, like at the end of the day, yeah, maybe the group does lose half a point, but it's worth it to have that dancer still be part of the team and still feel like part of the team. Like I said, it's not my experience that dancers do lose points for that. And I think some competitions probably even have policies around that type of thing. But it is a concern that I hear voiced from parents and teachers and things like that. So taping and bracing might be one of the modifications that we might recommend as dancers are rehabbing from an injury. Something else that is often kind of present is modifying footwear. And so this could be say a dance is being performed in heels, like character shoes or something like that, and a dancer's maybe not at the point in their rehab where they can be performing in a heel, so it's recommended that they perform on a flat foot. Again, the audience is likely not going to notice, and even if they do, same point as the bracing and taping, it's probably worth it to preserve that dancer's mental health. So heels are a common one that we might modify. Point shoes are another common one that we might modify. This one's a bit trickier for competitions because oftentimes a dance is classified in either a point category or a more open ballet or a demi-point category or demi-character or whatever. So it is a little bit trickier for a competition that maybe that is a little bit less likely. But for a performance or a show, your audience, the audience is made up mostly of parents anyway, and your audience is really not going to care or notice if one of the dancers is performing on demi-point rather than wearing point shoes. And if you're worried about aesthetics and it not looking the same, potentially you can put them in a soft block shoe that aesthetically looks similar to a point shoe, but they're not actually going fully up on point. So again, there's ways that we can accommodate this if we're willing to problem solve and come up with solutions. Another modification that we sometimes make is dancers maybe not dancing 100% of the sections of a dance. So I'm just trying to think of an example. So say a dancer maybe isn't turning on a particular leg. So maybe they've had an ankle sprain and they're not solid in their turns on one side. And there's a turn sequence that happens on that side and it's every single person on stage turning in unison. I think all of you can visualize what that looks like. So that's a modification where we're not just going to have one dancer not turning necessarily, but is there an opportunity for that dancer to exit the stage for that section of the dance and then come back on? Most dances have dancers exiting and entering the stage throughout the dance anyway. So are there still sections of a dance that a dancer can participate in, even if they've been taken out of one section where there's something happening that they can't be participating in? And sometimes that happens with something like floor work, for instance, or whatever. It doesn't really matter what the example is, but if there is a section that they can't participate in, maybe they can just exit the stage during that section and then come back on. Other modifications, and then probably the most common other modifications that we're recommending are physical modifications. And this is going to be really injury dependent, but things that we will sometimes modify will be, leg height with a certain leg in a certain position. So maybe they can do an arabesque, but only to 90 degrees and they can't do it above 90 yet. So modifying those types of moves. It could be, we sort of mentioned before, demi-point, things like that. So maybe the dancer is dancing on a flat foot instead of dancing on a releve or on a rise. There could be certain jumping things. I think about knee injuries where maybe they can jump. They've gotten to the point where you're doing impact, they can jump, but there might be a certain jump I don't know, just again, pulling examples, but a side Russian where they can't land on that leg yet. Maybe they're just not quite stable enough for a single leg landing. So maybe they can do a different jump instead. Maybe they can do it on the other leg, modify it, do into a 2-foot jump, whatever. So jump modifications, flat foot versus a releve, leg height for certain things. Sometimes there's just, a trick in a dance or something, where you think about like upper extremity injuries, if somebody's had like a wrist or an elbow or a hand injury, maybe they're supposed to do like a walkover or something that's got some upper body stuff in it, but they can't do that. So we might need to modify that one skill or that one trick to something else, because maybe lower body they're totally fine, and so they can do the whole rest of the dance, but they just can't like weight bear through a wrist or something like that. So these are all going to be really specific to whatever the injury is, but it is usually very possible to make these modifications to a dance. And I realize that it is like putting extra work on teachers, and so this does depend a little bit on sort of the age and the level and the experience of a dancer, because I wouldn't necessarily expect a 8, 9, 10-year-old to be able to like think through a dance and figure out every modification they need to make. And so that does put a lot of work on that teacher. But a, 12, 13, 14-year-old, they should be able to make a lot of those modifications themselves and even say, hey, there's this one move in the dance, I can't do this move, but could I do this instead? Or like come up with ideas and suggestions. And usually it's actually not that much work, and it might require, a little bit of like a run through with the group to make sure the spacing still works if there's a section where that dancer's leaving the stage for one section and coming back on. But at the end of the day, like I said, to like have these dancers still be engaged and still feel like they're a meaningful part of their team is really worth it. And realistically, it's work even if the dancer's not in the dance, because you have to reblock if you're removing them from the entire dance anyway. So I don't know that it's more work to make modifications than it would be to like completely remove a dancer from a dance. I will wrap things up there. I feel like I've droned on about that for a few minutes, but I just wanted to like really, put a podcast episode out about this, because like I said, I was getting so many comments in the DMs and just like messages and people reaching out to me who were telling me stories about how, medically they'd been cleared, their physio, their doctor said that they could participate, and then they still felt like they were being penalized for having had this injury. And really, like, if we want to continue to move the dance culture forward and we want to continue to evolve and we want to continue to like push for change within the dance industry, this is one of the things we need to really start to pay more attention to, because otherwise we will continue to have dancers who don't report injuries or push through things they shouldn't push through just so that they don't feel like they're going to be penalized for it. So I would love to hear your thoughts about that. Like I said, it was definitely a topic people were passionate about on social media. So if you have thoughts, opinions, stories, feel free to reach out to me. I always love all the emails I get from you guys after podcast episodes. You can also send me a DM or reach out to me on social media at Dance Physio Erika. And I think that is all for today. So thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.